And good evening, it's January 23rd, 2024, and we're on our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. Now, it's another series from Tim Mackie, and it's called Eat This Book, just because it sounded fascinating to me from the start. In TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the Eat This Book source video section set up for review. Because the purpose of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lectures first. That would be in the source video playlist. Because with this way of doing things, you can watch the video before we begin chatting. We still hope to keep these to around 15 to 20 minutes or so, because we want to make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we're going to continue our Eat This Book series with God Brings Life Out of Death. And this is part 1 on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So eat this book. God brings life out of death, and this is our part 1. So we finished our first section of God brings blessing out of curse, and that got us to Genesis chapter 12. And Tim introduced the analogy that sin was like a virus. It has a few challenges, but I like the direction that he heads. We needed to get to Genesis chapter 12 because the first 11 chapters, they gave us a picture of the origin, spread, depth, and width of that virus. And it also told us that God would stay with his creation because he's so devoted to us, even with the virus. So Genesis chapter 12 and beyond, well, it's the beginning, the development, and the growth of the cure, the antivirus. And that brings us to the next section, bring life out of death. So we'll be camping out a bit in one biblical story that you're probably familiar with. It's the story of Joseph. And I hope we get to find a few things about this story that maybe we have not seen before or taken the time to consider. But I want to take a quick side note and maybe a question. How far does tradition go back? I like this question because it opens up so many more. Well, at least for me in my lifetime, have gone from, say, the paper page to the digital page. I'm a big fan personally of digital, right? I can literally have thousands of books on something that I can hold in one hand. Yet I understand that many folks love the feel of the leather and the paper in their hands, the bound tomes of all sorts. I respect and appreciate that. Yet, not all that long ago, books were not for the common folks, at least to have on their own. They were in libraries for those that could get to one. Mostly, they were for the scholarly realm. But even things like personal Bibles, they're less than 150 years old, maybe closer to 100. Yet just remember that all of the folks we read about in Scripture did not have their own copies of anything. They were, at best, a communal property to be read and shared together, or passed along stories that were shared from those that had heard or read these and then shared. So we just need to remember that whichever medium one clings to today, it's still relatively new, in the larger scheme of things over time, and we are privileged to have such. So let's just continue digging in. The key that Tim brought out was that they were doing this study communally, right? I like that. Seems to bit more of combining the old and the new, yeah? As you can tell, with Tim, we've jumped ahead in the scroll of Genesis from chapter 12 to chapter 37. At the community church that Tim is at, Blackhawk at the time, they have pastors and teachers that share the load. So this is just Tim's next time to teach. And as you will see as we go along, that we'll be skipping parts that other teachers are covering. I hope that the things that we learn and talk about in our episodes, that they will help us strive to look more at all of the stories in Torah with fresh eyes and maybe some new things that are going to challenge us. So Tim started with the story of Mozambique. So here's the flag that he put up on the screen. The point is that the flag or the symbol told a story. As you can see in the graphic, the machine guns, they're part of that story. This is the only existing country flag that has a machine gun as part of its design. This country started as a land colonized by Portugal quite a long time ago. And in the middle of the 70s, the people of Mozambique, they gained their independence, right? At least colonial release. But inside of that, very quickly, there was a struggle for power. A brutal and bitter civil war began. And for approximately 15 years, from 77 to 92, that war raged on. And the machine guns were very much a part of their fledgling existence as they struggled to be an independent state. So the country grows more stable after that, a bit. And then in 2006, a group of artists, Christian artists, are part of a greater collection of artists called the Nucleo de Art. They came together to create art that told stories of hope for their people in the future. That kind of art is my favorite kind, especially when you see it and maybe can start to see the story before it's even shared with you. The expression of a time or a life or an event that has been deeply impacted by these artists, it's in this sculpture. So this group of artists, they wanted to also add the lens of the hope of the gospel in their work, the impact of the expression on them. They had lots of art created over many years, but one particular piece ended up gaining international attention. It's in a British museum today. It's a large sculpture of a tree and surrounding animals, right? It's called the Tree of Life. It stands over 10 feet tall, and the most remarkable part of this artistic creation is that it's made entirely out of machine gun parts from that brutal, bloody, bitter civil war that killed so many people. The Tree of Life. Tim reminds us that the Tree of Life is attached to the stories at either end of our scriptures. First, of course, is in Genesis. The other is recorded in John the Visionary in the scroll of the Revelation, right? The image is part of the beginning, and yet I say it was also really not part of the end. It's rather more like the beginning of the next story that will start at the end of the scroll. The leaves will be for healing of the nations. There's a lot to be said in that. This tree of life is a symbol of hope, God's life restored to bring healing. Now we see the artistic expression revealed. Out of devastation, there is hope. I can't but help in my head to also remember the verses about swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Seems like much more appropriate items surrounding a tree of life. From death comes life. Tim covers the story starting in Genesis 37, and we're now covering the lineage and the stories of Jacob's offspring. Remember, Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, the son of Isaac, and both are dead. Interestingly enough, we covered some thoughts on Abraham and Isaac in our episodes with Tim and John and Carmen Imes. There's links to those in the description below. These folks, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, are they good guys or not so good guys? I believe, just like us, they are a mixture of both. Jacob, for instance, his name means both to follow or be behind, heel. That's that whole twin second child hanging on thing. Yet it also means to supplant, overreach, to deceive. And his name, well, it's changed in the story of his life and becomes Israel, to struggle or wrestle with God. I love how Tim reminds us that these folks, they're just like us, that they're really no different. And we should very much see ourselves in them. That's probably a more scary thought than I'd care to admit. So we're dropped off right at the Joseph story, and already we have a troubling story and a troubling thought. Joseph, he's 17 years old. Every single one of his brothers are older than him, except for Benjamin. And his father, Jacob, well, he was obsessed with Rachel, his mother, right? And had, and I think we can all admit, an unhealthy relationship with that, as he did not love or care for all of his other wives or sons the same way. This is expressed in the rather infamous story of the coat of many colors. We could maybe guess that he was preferential towards Joseph, but the coat, that's a rather overt expression, and it causes a stir in the family. I've heard a number of discussions about this story, and I tend to lean away from the typical children's story about Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I tend to lean towards the long sleeve coat or overcoat, one that when it's worn, showed status and preference, a fancy wear overcoat. Because we only see this word, this description, this purpose of this coat, only 5 places in Scripture. 3 are in relation to Joseph. The other 2 are in relation to Tamar in the scroll of 1 Samuel. It's with King David's children are involved. And that also is a story with reprehensible behavior. So back to Joseph. And as for the brothers, except for Benjamin, they're all older, and they are not about to be upstaged by this younger brother, especially with those due inheritance, the oldest sons. So, suffice to say, the story is not hard to grasp because they really didn't like Joseph at all. Tim brings up a good point and I want to pause a minute here and discuss. Because we see the stories in Scripture, and we, in our current moral context, we view them as questionable, and we wonder if God is blessing them. If he is, then what about the behavior that's attached to it? I agree. It's a very good question, and maybe there's a lot to consider here. And we are no means going to be able to answer all of the questions from this, right? So prepare to have some boxes and put them on a shelf. Because Tim does bring up that more often than we care to admit, the actions in the stories are to help us see some behaviors not to do. And yet, we still need to pause and remember also that these are people in a different time and a different culture, and things will be different. We should actually expect that. So I'll bring up a sticky discussion, since might as well chat about it. If nothing more, just put some more boxes on the shelves. There's inference to multiple wives, and that is being wrong. That's from Tim. Makes me wince a bit. I agree, and I struggle with it, but we have to remember this is a story about them. So let's use this example of Jacob, Israel, as this example with his wives. And we're about to get reminded of this kind of behavior with Jacob and his wives as we get to the instructions eventually we're going to get that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. We get to a part of those instructions, and if we know this story, then these instructions, they're going to stand out bold and true, right? It's Deuteronomy 21, 15 through 17. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then it shall be in the day that he wills what he has to his sons, that he cannot make the son of the loved the firstborn before the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. To him belongs the right of the firstborn. So it seems that God, eventually, he addresses the behavior of Jacob, and that part of the story anyways, because he lets them know, these children of Israel, these hundreds of years later, you've probably heard this in a story about your past. And this is to remind you of that behavior. And, well, it will not be part of the land that I'm going to be giving you. So we get this one thing addressed. Yet, we still have more than that, at least for me, that need boxes, and maybe ones I might never open again until the end, when I can ask more questions. Because the instruction never addresses how to deal with having loved and unloved wives, how God will deal with that treatment. It's with our hearts. And second, wouldn't it have just been easier to not have a second wife? So, yes, it's messy, with no clear answer, only more questions. The instruction seems to directly deal with the Jacob behavior. It still leaves some things hanging. Again, uncomfortable, and yet it is part of the story, and we'll just need to realize that it is, and then move on. Put it in a box on the shelf. So Jacob, treating Joseph with preference that should not be, and resentment builds with the brothers. Next week, we're going to get to the dreams of Joseph and the reaction of the entire family to it. We can ask more uncomfortable questions. And one of them is, were we really surprised? This should be a very fun series. Lots of questions. Hopefully a few answers. But also hopefully a few eye-opening moments as well. Because eating this book is one thing, but I suspect digesting it might be a bit more challenging. And thanks for with us tonight on another Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet.